Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to our 8th lecture in the course on Introduction to Kinship and Family in India. In this lecture, we are going to look at how kinship has now evolved to a study that includes different dimensions of being and relating. In this specific lecture, we are looking at how reproductive technologies and new forms of medicine have created new forms of kinning and kinship. You will be surprised to think at how technology mediates with our intimate lives. We usually think of technology as a behemoth and as something that's distant to our understanding of ourselves and our kin. But here within kinship and in emerging studies, technology operates in a very important way to think of how we think of our kin and relationships. Thus, in this lecture, we are going to look at how technology is reframing certain ideas of biology and marriage itself. Again, going back to our fundamental questions about biology, in many ways technology is actually resurrecting these questions. Thus, technologies such as the new reproductive technologies such as IVF or in vitro fertilization, commercial surrogacy which involves IVF, and other forms of engagement are actually leading people to think about how they rethink biology. Other forms of medical intervention such as genetic counseling and genetic disease, which are being traced through family histories, are becoming important nodes of rethinking family and kin again. Part of all this research has been embedded within the West, but now a significant number of research is being conducted in India and other parts of the world as well that negotiates with the idea of reproductive technologies especially. The field of kinship within the new reproductive technologies is ever increasing and becoming more and more popular and dynamic. Current research spans parts of the world such as Mexico, Russia, Ecuador, India, South Africa, Australia, and other important sections of the globe. The shift is palpable. In the initial lectures that we studied, we rarely spoke of the new world or the contemporary world. We spoke of tribal societies and of erstwhile primitive groups surrounding Africa and Asia. Now our focus, as you can see, is shifting to a transnational global space where newer emerging nations and countries are coming into being in understanding what we think about kinship and also culture. Culture is no more a domain of those who inhabit other spaces such as tribal and primitive cultures, but cultures that form global spaces. Economies, different kinds of trade and migration are becoming part of our analysis of kinship and relatedness. Relatedness continues to be an important part of this engagement, as Jeanette Edwards finds in the study of biotechnology in European kinship. She suggests that the move away from biology has not been easy and continues to mark the engagement of Euro-American kin studies. The idea of biological roots or genetic ties is still the most important by which Europeans and Americans think of themselves. A move towards and away from biology has meant, according to Edwards, an engagement with relatedness anew. If you remember our lecture on relatedness, we have thought of relatedness as something that is linked to many ideas of being and relating, and most importantly is also linked to our notion of the indigenous and the folk. The move away from it has meant that we are now looking again at newer ideas within Euro-American kinship of what comprise indigenous and folk ideas. Here we are now at a moment in time when anthropology is actually reframing its subjects of study. Anthropology is again thinking about what makes up its focus areas. Is it cultures that are primitive and other than the West, which was traditionally the case within anthropological studies during Levi-Strauss and Radcliffe-Brown's analysis, Or are we moving towards an anthropology which is looking at culture itself and how culture makes and remakes itself across borders and across different contexts? This is important in understanding what the folk means anymore. The folk is not what it is understood within the frames of reference in other cultures. The folk is not primitive or non-Western. The folk exists also within Western contexts. The folk is not in opposition to modernity or something that is literate, but has its own belief system that spans borders, globes, cultures and ideas. Thus, folk and indigenous theories are becoming an important way to relook Euro-American ideas of being as well. Anne Cadore looks at Spanish grandparental relationships and suggests that plural forms of kinship are becoming more and more important in navigating the steadfast importance of biology within Euro-American kinship. She suggests that plural notions of kinship are enacted through different modes and beings, just like Janet Carsten suggests about relatedness. Plural kinship can be found in things, memories, homes, structures, in breastfeeding, in food, in clothing, in acts of transference, and in gifts. Thus, kinship cannot be only one thing, it can be many things at the same time. Such a thought is both revolutionary and dangerous to the idea of established notions of who and what are kin. The moment we start thinking about kin and kinship beyond certain identified categories, we open up a social structure which has a lot more to offer in terms of how we think of our kin and kinship. Thus, fictive kin or those who are not real kin becomes an important question now. Is there truly a fiction in kinship, or are the real are fictionalized renditions of kinship itself? The boundaries between what is real and unreal becomes more and more thin and can be marked out completely. We are now willing to negotiate with the idea of what we understand as kin rather than what categories are brought to us in our understanding of kin itself. In that sense, Jeanette Edwards' study of kinship within the Euro-American context deliberately engages with biotechnology to bring forth a more intimate and dynamic notion of what technology does to the idea of biology itself. In many of the studies since Edwards' study and since the seminal volume by McKinnon and Franklin on relative values, biotechnology has become a very important source of conversation within kinship. It is suggested that technology has ramifications beyond just what we think is relevant or irrelevant in thinking about persons and our intimate relations with different persons. Thus, in the study by Charis Thompson on the IVF clinic, she talks about the mode of strategic naturalizing. Strategic naturalizing is enacted, according to Thompson, by many in vitro fertilization clinics dealing with childless couples unable to have children in trying to make meaning out of the roles that are fixed in our minds of motherhood and fatherhood. In Western societies, because of the importance given to biology and genetic links, mothers and fathers are stuck in time within particularized roles. You cannot have more than one mother and you cannot have more than one father. Even though, as Bob Simpson has suggested in the last lecture that I discussed, divorce gives you the possibility of having more than one mother, even though she is your stepmother, and more than one father, even though he may be your stepfather. But the idea of motherhood and fatherhood becomes even more complicit when reproductive technologies enter into the act of making children. The simple act of making children, which does not involve sexual procreation anymore, is itself revolutionary for the idea of kinship. Suddenly, as you can imagine, you do not need to have sex to have children anymore. You actually have sex in the laboratory through the Petri dish. So, in vitro fertilization returns the idea of biology itself by suggesting that it can assist in making children, the fundamental assumption of kinship till Schneider broke it. This means itself that technology is facilitating new meanings to emerge on how we can think of pater, genitor, mater and genetrix. These are important categories that earlier classical kinship took for granted and did not question. And suddenly, in our contemporary understanding of kin and kinning, we are faced with new modes of thinking about kinship and about how we can engage with ideas of making kin. With the intervention of reproductive technologies, Caris Thompson suggests that the clinic becomes a very important space within which kinship narratives are made. Thus, it's not the anthropologist anymore who's writing your genealogical charts and mapping your cross-cousin marriage exchange formats. It is the doctor in the IVF clinic who's suggesting how to make meaning out of the procedures of having children. Let me give you a brief introduction into how IVF works. There are different modes and permutations of how IVF works. And most importantly, IVF entails the use of technology to facilitate reproduction itself. After the couple who seek to have a child donate their respective sperm and eggs, the donated sperm and egg is manipulated by the doctor within the laboratory as part of a technique which has been revolutionized to have children. There are different types of in vitro fertilization techniques, but the end result is the laboratory manipulation of sperm and egg to create an embryo or fetus embryo, which is then transferred into the woman's uterus for a 9-month pregnancy. As newer technologies emerge, we hear of artificial wombs coming into the picture, which will create for kin making. But for the purpose of our lecture here, let us return to Caris Thompson. For Thompson, the most important conflict that emerges with the use of in vitro fertilization is the conflict between those who donate eggs and those who claim to be the mothers and fathers. Infertility as a social problem often is translatable into newer modes of medical problems. In such a situation, if a woman is unable to have a child biologically, she seeks the support of a third party in the form of either an egg donor or a commercial surrogate. Similarly, a man who is unable to have a child biologically may seek the support of a sperm donor. The entry of a third party in the form of an anonymous or known donor or a surrogate complicates the plot that we think of in terms of parentage and children. Thus, biological parentage is not a given anymore. However, for those who are seeking children through IVF and the birth of the subsequent child, this important node has to be navigated through an elaborate narrative of how biology must be made. In case of Thompson's study, it is navigated through very precise choreographies. Thus, the doctor must enact a particular script of suggesting that the woman who is contracting the IVF or carrying the child is the mother rather than the anonymous donor. Or in case where the woman is unable to carry the child and seeks a surrogate, the mother who seeks the surrogate is the real mother and not the surrogate. Caris Thompson calls these negotiations very important in case of identifying motherhood. There are two ways in which she identifies it. One is procreative intent. By procreative intent, Thompson means the desire to have a child. Whether you carry or not is part of the script, but the desire to have a child and ultimately to become part of the child's kin networks marks motherhood in particular ways. So even though you may not be able to carry your own child or give your own egg to the pregnancy, you are by your procreative intent the mother of the child. But the other part of this is also equally important in thinking of motherhood, that of custodiality. The custodial relationship that emerges from the infertility clinic is, according to Thompson, one where a woman, for all practical purposes, shows an intent to carry the child and give birth to it, but may not fall into identified kinship categories. Thus, a surrogate or an egg donor might be an example of someone who shows custodial intent. In that sense, custodial intent means that they are inclined to support the mother who seeks to have the child but do not want to take up the role themselves. Thus, procreative intent becomes very, very important in designating motherhood itself. Social and biological motherhood falls back into the same category that Edwards is saying we are trying to now dissect and do away with in contemporary studies of kinship. However, social and biological motherhood is critical in understanding how biology works in its different forms of narrativization to think of mothering and motherhood. For instance, in the work of Helen Ragone, who looks at surrogacy in America in the 1980s, the idea of the adoptive mother is predominant in thinking through how women who are unable to birth children seek the support of other women to become mothers. Similarly, in Fonseca's work in Brazil, fatherhood is also split into two. J. A. Barnes, in an earlier classical study, had maintained that motherhood remains the only biological standard within kinship, as the genetrix and the social mother are all in one. Again, a fallacy of Western thought, because she carries the pregnancy and then can take over the role of the mother. But fatherhood is always open to doubt due to its physical non-manifestation. Thus, the genitor and the pater might be two separate people without knowing who is who. But Claudia Fonseca, in her work in Brazil, suggests that men actually constantly seek recognition through this coming together of the pater and the genitor. Many men may reject it, many genitors may reject the role of the social father because they do not want to take it on. However, what new reproductive technologies such as IVF are doing is creating this sense of the split fatherhood into a unified notion, wherein they constantly seek to suggest that the father can only be the one who gives his sperm and is part of the arrangement. Whereas motherhood, unlike what Barnes has suggested, is split in new fertility technologies, in case of fatherhood, it is unified and brought together in one seamless whole. Such a study continues to provoke us to think about what medical technologies are doing not only to the body but to our sense of self. Thus, very interestingly, in Kaja Finkler's work, she suggests that we are heading towards a deeper engagement with what is known as the medicalization of kin. The medicalization of kin as an idea is very interesting and is based on certain negotiations with new technologies and new forms of medicine. Here she is provoked to think of genetic medicine and the desire for biotech and for biomedicine to constantly provoke and think about who forms kin and parent through a mapping of past family history. Whenever you go to a doctor, for instance, you have to record your family history in terms of the kind of diseases your family had or any kind of debility they suffered from. This has become a mainstay within biomedicine, according to Kaja Finkler, pointing towards an idea where nature and biology is being forced back into the study of kinship. So while we may be moving towards plural ideas of kinship, biology is coming through insidiously into our understanding of kinship through the practice of medicine itself. Finkler finds that the medicalization of kinship means that when we go to visit a doctor, we are asked to resurrect our past, present and future in very different ways. Thus, genetic mapping of your disease or your health involves you remembering kin you may not really identify as kin, extended family, distant kin, and others who may not exist in your universe of relationships. This becomes important to therefore think of biology and genes as modes of being and becoming. We are at a stage where we are unable to break away from the shackles that biology presents to us in terms of being the standard of kinship and kinning. In such a situation, we are constantly questioning how we think of ourselves. Thus, in Finkler's work, couples or women seeking a genetic history of debilitating diseases, such as cancer and others, have to go back to the past to trace relationships with kin they have no relationships with otherwise who may have suffered from the same disease. In this form, we continuously think of how we can reframe our relationships and our mode of being and kinning. Similarly, in another very interesting work by the anthropologist Sine Howell, while there are no technologies involved, the idea of biology is constantly resurrected in another space of kinning and kinship, that of adoption. Sine Howell looks at transnational adoption, wherein couples from the Nordic countries such as Sweden and Denmark adopt children from countries such as India, China and Korea and take them back home with them. In such a situation, the idea of biology becomes very complicated. While they are adopting racially distinct children who do not look Swedish or Danish, they must nonetheless make those children into Swedes or Danes. Thus, young African children adopted by Swedish couples must undergo a whole process of biological kinning. Here it is interesting to note that fictive kinship is not just as imagined non-biological relationships, but actually even biological relationships. As I've been mentioning over the past few lectures, fictive kinship involves a fiction of biology, but the construction of biological relations also involves a fiction of biology itself. To explain this further, Howell suggests that the kinning, and the word she uses is kinning, the kinning of transnationally adopted children happens through three very predominant stages. The first is that of pre-pregnancy, where a couple decides on a child they wish to adopt through the adoption agency. This involves the seeking of the child, the memories of the child, the constant recourse to the child's photograph, and thinking of themselves as seeking to adopt and deciding on the adoption process. The second stage that appears is that of pregnancy, where the couple seeking to adopt a child wait for the child to come to them in their home country. This is a long period which is navigated through bureaucracy and anxieties and doubts about whether the child will eventually come to them or not. Often couples describe this period as a pregnancy period, where it is a question of waiting for the child to come. The idiom of using pregnancy also means to talk of the child being born from them. It is important in many ways for couples to react and link themselves to this child biologically, which they are unable to have due to various reasons. The transnationally adopted child therefore becomes one with the parents in this act of waiting and seeking to have children. Thus, pregnancy or the wait for the child becomes very, very important. The third phase, where the child is finally born, is when the child travels to the country of the adoptive parents and becomes a part of their family. To be born is again a very biological moment and idiom, but being born also includes the child therefore being officially adopted legally. For many couples, the child is reborn. It's not just that the child was born earlier, but the child is being reborn now with a new identity. The creation of adoption papers with the child's name and new forms of address impacts the way in which we imagine the birth of this child. The adopted child now becomes unlike what he or she was earlier. He or she was earlier a Chinese or a Korean, but is now reborn as a Swede or a Danish or some other nationality. The idea of rebirth here means that the child has been transferred into a newer form of being. After birth, it becomes important for couples to channelize the birth of their child through modes that involve particular forms of socialization. So the child is actively socialized into becoming a citizen of the country to which the child's parents belong. This is particularly important so that the child can become one with his adoptive family. Sine Howell is particularly interested in looking at how this form of transference and kin making becomes an important node of establishing cultural linkages and ties of kin. It is also seen in Barbara Wesson's work, where she discusses how Indian children are again adopted by Swedish parents through large and long process of bureaucracy, ultimately to be made into Swedes. The making of Swedish or European children, or the transference of children into the countries and cultures of their adoptive parents, involves particular forms of socialization into their language, into their school and education system, and into wearing the cultural clothing and rituals of those countries. I apologize. The interesting thing here is also that at some point of time, adoptive agencies suggest that children belonging to other racial ethnicities should be brought back to their biological roots to familiarize them about their origins. Because these children are racially different, the myth of adoption, or the fiction, I apologize, not the myth, the fiction or the narrative built around their adoption cannot be hidden for long. Thus, it has to be manifested through what are called as root trips back to their native biological countries to see where they belonged. These trips do not include meeting the children's biological parents, but acquainting them to a culture they may be familiar with, a culture that they might like, a culture that they earlier belonged to but do not belong to anymore. These are trips to make sure that the children do not feel alienated in their new environment and with their adoptive parents, and remember where they came from racially so that they do not feel at conflict with themselves. Thus, biology, race, and the notion of birthing become very, very complicit in the making of fictive kin and non-fictive kin as well. Biology itself is narrated through different processes of being. Thus, Jeanette Edwards' contention that one can move away from an understanding of biology becomes very difficult in understanding kinship itself. When we look at technology and its permutability and its fluidity in terms of making kinship relations, these things continuously keep coming to our mind in thinking about kin and kinship. Taking Kaja Finkler's idea of genetic kin and the medicalization of kin forward, the work by Featherstone et al. On risky relations suggests that all kinship relations due to this marking of genes are inherently risky. We all carry mutations within us which may be passed down to the next generation. In that sense, biological ties and ties that kinship and family privilege are essentially dangerous also. If we carry genes that may pass on diseases, we also implicate our relatives and our close connections in very different ways. Here is an idea of kinship which is not necessarily positive but resurrected through a form of negativity that may be very, very difficult to channelize through kinship. As I mentioned in the earlier lecture, Bob Simpson mentions that divorced families emerge through a sense of negativity and disillusion and not through a sense of positivity that usually marks our understanding of kinship and family. This is particularly important when we think about how medicine enters the definitions of kin and kinship. Here it is also important to understand that families may emerge from negative connectedness and ideas of how diseases follow through genes and our oft repeated conceptualization of blood. Another anthropologist, Sarah Gibbon, talks about how breast cancer victims constantly think of their past, present and future in terms of their genetic ties that they share and will share. Breast cancer victims especially mark out their kinship tree and family charts through ideas of disease, which is a very negative connotation attached to what we think of kinship and family. Here again and again we are constantly coming to the idea of how kinship is not only about solidarity, or as Schneider calls diffuse enduring solidarity which links generations across each other, but might also be a source of huge dissonance and conflict. Kinship might be the source of thinking through how families might fall apart because they carry exceptional diseases or genetic mutations. This is also interesting in thinking through kinship and kinning and kin as not something that is always permanent but open to fractures constantly. Medicine adds another layering to this idea of kinship. Most importantly, we keep coming back to this idea of how genes and biology are coming to be manufactured within the same space. Earlier, kinship was related to the idea of biology and biological procreation. Increasingly now, with the onset and the introduction of medicine and the medicalization of kin, biology or the idea of biological procreation is being displaced to bring in genes and genetic identity within the mapping of kin and family. This is particular when we think of how genes and genetic identity can be particularly important to actually pinpoint the idea of biology. Because genes can be mapped through tests such as the DNA test, it becomes particularly important to think of biology as something that is now being scientifically constructed within the notions of intimacy and kinship and family. We are now at a stage where we are rethinking our intimate relationships based on a more medicalized scientific notion of what it means to be genetically linked. Within such a space, it is important to understand that technologies exist in many ways within our everyday and intimate life. We are also trying to understand how we can make sense of our milieu through these technologies. Continuing with the theme of how genes and biology come together, it is important to know that within the context of India, the study of kinship in relation to biology and the new technologies is recently emerging. The study of kinship in India through technological intervention and this idea of genes is rather alien. Within Indian and South Asian culture, genes and biology are not given as much importance as they are given in Euro-American kinship. The past lectures have shown how marriage ties, ties that you share with cross cousins, neighbors, relatives, through breastfeeding, through food consumption, are also important nodes of thinking of kin and kinship within South Asia and India. This means that biology and its construction within Indian kinship itself is a very fraught terrain. We have to rethink how we imagine biology here as opposed to in other contexts such as Euro-America. We are faced with newer technologies, however, which bring in old values that Euro-American kinship legitimizes. So, for instance, in the transnational commercial gestational surrogacy arrangement in India, which until recently was involved couples coming in from abroad to hire a woman to carry their baby through IVF technology, the idea of kinship became even more complicated. To give you a brief idea of how commercial surrogacy had worked in India and still works in India, it is important to understand what it involves in terms of kinship and kinning. Thus, when we think of surrogacy in a more important way, let us look at how we can imagine surrogacy as it, just to give you a brief idea of how surrogacy is imagined in India. If you know what surrogacy means, it actually involves a woman carrying a child for a childless couple, and often this woman is given compensation or some kind of money or something in kind in exchange of the child that she gives to the couple. But in contemporary India, there are different forms of surrogacy being enacted. Why I am discussing surrogacy in particular is because surrogacy has become a very potent space to discuss the engagement with technology. I will also discuss how organ donation is an equally important space to discuss about kinship and technology. So, within surrogacy, there are primarily three types. There is the traditional surrogacy arrangement. This involves couple hiring a woman to carry a child for them. In traditional surrogacy, the man might end up having sexual relations with this woman to facilitate the birth of this child, primarily because the wife of the man or the adoptive mother of the child is unable to have a child. The other form, which is genetic surrogacy, involves the husband and wife engaging a surrogate to have a child for them. But in this case, there are no sexual relationships involved. The couple use IVF or other forms of intervention technology where the man gives his sperm and the surrogate is inseminated with that sperm and carries the child to term. The important thing in genetic surrogacy is that the surrogate gives both her eggs and her womb to the pregnancy. The adoptive mother again remains a non-participant. Finally, in gestational surrogacy, the couple hire a surrogate who may give birth to a boy or girl, but here the mother to be will give her eggs and the father to be will give his sperm to the surrogate who only carries the child. So it's an act of gestation alone. This system has been facilitated by emerging IVF technology where the surrogate's contribution to the pregnancy is only that of her uterus and nothing beyond. Earlier in genetic surrogacy, because IVF was at its nascent stage at that time, the adoptive mother could not, the process of extracting eggs was difficult, and she could not give her. This is still in process in case the adoptive mother is not fertile or her eggs are not viable, in which case the father can only give his sperm. But in gestational surrogacy, they are able to provide proper technological intervention where the woman gives her egg and the man gives his sperm, and the embryo is formed in the lab, which is then transferred into the surrogate's uterus to give birth to the child. Now, traditional surrogacy is still practiced, though many people don't talk about it. It has become something that's more or less extinct because of the stigma of sexual relations here that the surrogate and the man might share, and it's something that is not encouraged. Genetic surrogacy is also practiced, but was mostly practiced in earlier when technology had not developed to facilitate the donation of eggs from the mother. The most common form that is practiced in India today is gestational surrogacy, which is commercially viable, was commercially viable till 2016, when actually the government banned commercial surrogacy. But before that, couples could donate their eggs and sperm, and it would be put in a lab to produce an embryo, which would then be transferred into the surrogate's womb for 9 months, after which she would be compensated for the birth of the child. Now, gestational surrogacy became exceedingly popular as time went by. And in India, until 2016, with the coming in of the new surrogacy law, commercial gestational surrogacy had a transnational character. It was hugely popular and became popular because of the availability of poor Indian women who were willing to carry a child for very little money or compensation. This meant that a lot of couples from all over the world would come to India to contract a surrogacy arrangement. There were gay couples, there were heterosexual couples, and there were also Indian couples within India who contracted the arrangement with an Indian surrogate. An IVF clinic would facilitate the whole arrangement and contract, at the end of which the surrogate would give up the child in exchange for her fee. Since 2016, the Government of India is in the process of formulating a law that bans commercial surrogacy in favor of altruistic surrogacy. Altruistic surrogacy involves the surrogate's participation without any form of compensation. The couple in an altruistic surrogacy arrangement may only pay for her medical bills and for the process itself, but are not supposed to provide any compensation to the surrogate. This form of surrogacy is allowed in many parts of the world, including in the UK and some parts of America and Australia. In other parts of the world, such as America and Australia, some of the states in Australia and America actually have legalized commercial surrogacy as well. The interesting thing about the Indian law is that it's still under consideration with the Parliament. It has not been passed and made into an act. It is because of this lack of legislation and the grey area that surrogacy thrived for so many years in India. This has also meant that this permutation and combination of fathers, mothers, donors and surrogates has posed new problems for the way in which we think of kinship in India itself. The study of surrogacy in India has become a very important terrain to mark technology and the ideas linked to women's labor, but has also provided a key engagement with how South Asian notions of kinship intermingle with those of technologically based kinship ideas abroad. In Amrita Pandey's exceptional work on Indian surrogates, she notes in her interviews with Indian surrogates that many of the surrogate mothers thought of their contribution to the pregnancy as the most important point of making the child. Even though they were only carrying the child and were told by the clinics that they are nothing more than rooms for rent or just incubators, the surrogates refused to believe that they had no role to play in the actual makeup of the child. Many of the surrogates suggested that it is their 9 months of labor which makes the child what it is. This is an important intervention into thinking about how surrogacy imagines and builds an idea of kinship and children. Even though clinics in India and South Asia attempt to tell surrogates that they have no role to play genetically, which is a Euro-American idea, genetically in the birth of the child, the surrogate creates another notion of her contribution to the baby she's carrying by suggesting that it is her blood and her womb that nurtures the child into what it is, into its birth, even though in terms of genes which are very specifically identified in the surrogacy arrangement as eggs and sperm, are not linked to her. Interestingly, the feminist scholar Nivedita Menon mentions that the gestational surrogacy arrangement in India involves multiple fictions of kinship and biology that are enacted. She suggests that IVF doctors actively tell surrogates to denaturalize their tie with the baby, even though they are carrying the child in their body, and actively endorses the links that the couple have to the child, even though they have no physical linkage with the pregnancy and have only contributed their sperm and egg. This form of different notions of biologization means that our idea of biology within kinship, as I've mentioned before, is itself complicit. It is itself fraught and multiple. There is no one notion of biology that emerges, and medical technology such as IVF and arrangements such as surrogacy make it even more and more difficult to understand biology and kinship. In my own study of gestational surrogacy, this form of engagement becomes even more difficult as I mapped how kinship is made and unmade in gestational surrogacy in India. Thus, in my study, interestingly, I find 3 stages of kinship working to come together to understand how the surrogate makes meaning and how the arrangement is played out with couples who want to have children with the intervention of the surrogate and the clinic. In my study, I found that kinship is processual and continuously made and unmade through the process of the intervention of the technology and the narrative surrounding biology and technology. I particularly identify 3 stages similar to how Howell understands the 3 stages that mark the adoption of transnational children by parents coming in from Europe to adopt children in Korea, China, India and Africa. Thus, the 3 stages that I identify that mark surrogacy in India are: the first is that of intention, the second is that of pregnancy, and the third is that of membership. In intention, couples and surrogates are asked to make explicit their links, their desire for a child. Thus, the surrogate must make explicit that she doesn't desire the child, and the couple must make sure that they do desire a child, and they feed into the idea of how their intention marks their notion of entering the arrangement. Here, intention is also similar to what I discussed in terms of Caris Thompson idea of procreative intent that I just discussed, where the desire to parent marks participation in new reproductive technologies or in the method of creating children in labs. The second stage of pregnancy is very particular, where I call what I call the alien pregnancy. The alien pregnancy is such because it is housed within the body of the surrogate who does not want the child and belongs genetically to the parents or couples who want the child. This leads to a sense of disembodied relationships where the couple are unable to make sense of the alienness that inhabits their relationship within the surrogacy arrangement. Disembodiment comes because of the alienness of the pregnancy, which belongs to the surrogate bodily and physically, but emotionally and genetically belongs to the parents or couples. Finally, membership is linked to the act of birth, when after the child is born, especially to couples, foreign couples, the act of citizenship and membership begins. In the process of citizenship, where foreign couples sought to get citizenship for their children from their respective embassies, countries and different countries desired the DNA test and the relinquishment from the mother, from the surrogate, to give membership to the child. The DNA test is meant to ascertain genetic ties to the father, and the relinquishment from the surrogate is meant to make sure that she as the mother has given up on the child. This is a very important point because by relinquishment, different countries actually understand that the surrogate is the real mother through the act of carrying the baby. They do not understand or identify the genetic tie of the adoptive mother even if she has given her egg, because that is irrelevant to thinking about surrogacy and motherhood. These modes become even more important when we think about importantly about how surrogacy becomes this vast medium of narratives of thinking about kinship and how people navigate their moment of relationships with children and with kinship and kinning. This is particularly potent in my research, where I find that clinicians, embryologists and IVF specialists actually act as matchmakers in making kin out of children who will be born in the arrangement. What do I mean by matchmaking? IVF specialists, doctors and embryologists actively get involved in creating matches between donors, surrogates and couples. Going back to our previous discussion of what gestational surrogacy involves, in many cases where the adoptive mother is unable to give either her eggs or her womb to the pregnancy, an anonymous egg donor may be called upon to donate her eggs to the arrangement. In many cases, such as where both the couples are gay, the requirement of an anonymous or known egg donor is absolutely essential, because while the sperm may come from one of the fathers, the egg has to come from another woman. This means that doctors actively involve themselves in thinking through the idea of how which egg should go with which couple. This is interesting because one would like to think of genes and scientific notions of eggs and sperms as floating without identity, but they are particularly important in understanding kinship and social and biological evaluations of fatherhood and motherhood. This is why doctors become matchmakers in thinking of how which permutation and combination works best. In Amrita Pandey's work and in the work of the organization Sama, it is found that doctors actually indulge couples who seek surrogates and donors from a particular caste or religious group. Even though caste and religion has very little to do with the biological identification of the gene, such as the egg or the sperm, the recruitment of women from particular caste and communities mean that couples in India and couples from abroad tend to think of the idea of a biological element through particular notions of belonging. In India especially, genes and this idea of community identity becomes very particular. In my research, I find that a lot of IVF specialists enact their role of matchmakers, especially in case of an altruistic surrogacy arrangement. In an altruistic surrogacy arrangement where you do not pay the surrogate for carrying the child, couples often fall back upon close relatives to become surrogates to their children. This means that certain sets of relatives are to be potential surrogates and not all. In the explanation of who can or cannot be a surrogate to your future child, doctors in India enact what Aditya Bharadwaj calls a kind of gene sutra, a local indigenous folk notion of relatedness which plays with the idea of genes and biology. Let me show you how within an altruistic arrangement, which category of relatives can or cannot be surrogates as per IVF specialists and embryologists' notions of kinship and genes. Thus, if this is the couple who seek to enter into a surrogacy arrangement, for this couple, ideally potential surrogates would include the wife's brother's wife and the wife's sister, as well as the wife's mother. On the husband's side, the husband's brother's wife is also a potential candidate. However, women who cannot be potential candidates of surrogacy are the husband's mother and the husband's sister. Here, to explain this complicated narrative where certain women can be surrogates and certain women cannot be surrogates, one has to fall back on the wife giver, wife taker theory that we have been discussing till now in the past few lectures. If I divide this group, we can already see that there are two sets of, there is a wife taker and a wife giver. In terms of giving birth for the wife takers group, which we call A, and the wife givers group, which we call B, the idea of a child coming from the womb and not related to genetically, from the womb of the women of close kin, only those women are eligible who belong to the wife givers group. This is primarily because the production of children must come from women who belong to the wife givers group and not from the wife takers group. This is important in the sense that the man's sister has already been given away to another group and her reproductive capacity belongs to her husband's group and cannot be demanded for by the husband's kin. This goes also for the husband's mother, who already belongs to her husband's family or the man's family and cannot be asked to contribute to the pregnancy. On the other hand, women belonging to the wife's group are already within the space of the wife givers and their reproductive potential is also available again to the wife taker. Thus, in many ways, the wife's sister, the wife's brother's wife, who has also come in from another family into this family and belongs in relationships of wife giving, and that of the wife's mother become potential candidates for surrogacy. Similarly, in the husband's group, the brother's wife can be a potential surrogate because she again belongs to a group which is not that of the wife takers. She has come in from another family which has given her to the wife takers for her reproductive potential. To think through alliance theory and modern contemporary ideas of genes, we have to resurrect such certain notions of exchange and marriage to think about how genes are manufactured in their imagined space in India. To make meaning out of a complicated exercise such as surrogacy, doctors have to be imaginative and fall back onto folk notions of kinship and kinning to be able to tell couples that they are ultimately linked to the child that the surrogate or the donor is carrying for them. This is a difficult enterprise and requires much maneuvering, as Caris Thompson has mentioned earlier. This choreography of wife givers and wife takers becomes an essential way in which people make meaning of the children they are giving birth to through artificial technologies such as IVF. It is also important to understand here, as opposed to the Western notion of genes and biology, in India genes and biology remain fluid and open to interpretation. They are also deeply linked to our ideas of marriage and affinity, thereby making it essential to think of biology and genes through the kind of marriage alliances we undertake culturally. Commercial surrogacy, as it is practiced in India, offers fertile spaces of research to think about kinship and kinning itself. In the last stage that I discuss about citizenship, the clash between a Western notion of blood, genes and roots is seen to be very evident in the way in which actually surrogacy takes place in India. Thus, when foreign consulates refuse to give a birth certificate to the child or a citizenship to the child born to an Indian surrogate, it is primarily because they still consider that the Indian surrogate is the mother of the child through the act of gestation. The egg does not form an important element of the identity given to the child, even though it may come from the adoptive mother. This kind of conflict makes it evident that kinship itself continues to play with the idea of motherhood in its multiple forms and fatherhood in its multiple forms. New reproductive technologies, interestingly, are placing motherhood in more than 2 or 3 forms of being, whereas fatherhood continues to be unitary and solid through the DNA test. This is also a gendered notion of how we think about parents and kinning in ways in which we are unable to understand and implicate new forms of technologies. In a final analysis and look at how technology is part of our understanding of kinship, I draw from how technology continues to mark Indian notions of kinship and kinning. Thus, Aditya Bharadwaj's analysis of adoption in India suggests that couples are usually reluctant to adopt outside the familial group because of the fear of what the child might come in with. Here, the fear of unknown genes are displaced onto ideas such as caste and community, which become difficult to understand and think of in terms of how the child will grow up. In India, adoptive children carry different meanings of biology as opposed to children being adopted abroad by Euro-American couples. Thus, for Indian couples, an Indian child may carry notions of other forms of debility which are found in its blood rather than its genes, because genes is a more manifest and problematic idea of biology. In such ideas, Bharadwaj finds that IVF works very well to create a false sense of biology and genes by creating children through borrowed sperm and eggs. And even though you may enter an IVF and surrogacy arrangement where you are borrowing eggs and sperm from donors and have a surrogate involved, you may still ultimately think of the child as yourself because of the way in which medicine and technology constructs the idea of biology and genes within the arrangement. Thus, to think through technology and the way it's imagined in creating kinship becomes an important node to look at contemporary forms of kin and kinning. In Ravinder Kaur's work on sex-selective abortion technologies, she finds that in states such as Punjab, Haryana and Rajasthan, the ultrasound machine continues to be the tool used to eliminate daughters from families altogether. Female infanticide and female feticide is used in particular ways to make sure that parents eliminate the daughter altogether from the picture of familial inheritance and marriage ties. This has been linked to the abysmal sex ratio in parts of North India where girls are in fewer numbers than boys. This has created a large amount of it has created ripple effects in terms of marriage organization and other forms of familial and kinship relationships. Thus, we are entering into a space of kinship studies which includes our understanding of how we think of kin and kinship. Finally, to look at how these ideas work, we also have to look at how marriage is being reconstructed through technological intervention. Here, online matchmaking is becoming a particularly important tool to think of marriage in terms of what in the last lecture we discussed was Parvez Modi's identification of love marriage. In today's contemporary urban India, online matchmaking sites through places such as Shaadi.com and Tinder are becoming spaces where couples organize or reorganize their sense of marriage relationships by bringing together community and familial expectations with what they imagine is love and romance. Technology therefore has far-reaching consequences for familial kin and the way they imagine and think of their lives and their larger networks of kin. On that note, and to think more of different kinds of technology that enter into our everyday lives and how we think of ourselves and our intimate relations, we will go into the next lecture. But for now, thank you and see you soon.